the first Latin American briefing series of the academic year. I'm Alan Collada, acting interim director of the Center for Latin American Studies, and I just wanted to welcome you to this series for the initial Latin American briefing series. Before introducing our guest speaker, though, I did want to encourage all of you to sign up for our listserv with the Center of Latin American Studies as well, because we have a particularly rich and rather dense series of lectures and briefings coming up through the course of the quarter. Next week we will have urban planning in Brazil. We have particularly focusing on Brazil and Mexico this quarter and this academic year. And then 2 weeks hence we'll have another theme, in this case on the current drug wars in Mexico by a couple of journalists coming in. So it's, I think, a particularly interesting series. Welcome you to participate and sign up to get all of the information on the upcoming events. I want to also take this moment to thank the student organizations who are co-sponsoring this event, and they are the Latin American Business Group from Chicago Booth School, the Latin American Matters from the Harris School of Public Policy, and the Hispanic American Business Student Association here at Booth, who are co-sponsoring this series, and we thank you all. After the lecture and the Q&A session, we also will have a reception to which you're warmly invited in room 219. Okay, with those preliminaries, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Manuel Sànchez, who is currently the Deputy Governor of the Banco de Mexico. Mr. Sànchez holds a PhD in economics from this august institution, from the University of Chicago. Before joining the central bank, he was director of Alanza Mexico, the private equity unit of the BBVA Bancomer Financial Group. Previously, Mr. Sànchez was also director general of the Center for Economic Analysis and Research, ITAM, where he is currently professor of economics. He has been a consultant for several corporation and international institutions, and for me as a scholar, what's interesting as well, he is the author of numerous articles published in books, professional journals, and magazines, and he's author of the book Economía Mexicana para Desencantados, published in 2006. So if you join me in welcoming Mr. Sànchez for this first speaker.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's very nice to be back in my alma mater, especially because I don't have to face the professors in a workshop. I hope this presentation will go well and doesn't get as rough as my memories bring to my mind from those days. So, I'm really happy to be in this university. I'd like to thank Professor Curry and the center, the CAT Center of the University of Chicago, for this kind invitation to participate in the Latin American briefing series. Today I would like to talk about a topic that I hope is of interest to you, which is our recent experience in Mexico to stabilize the economy. And basically I would like to talk about how we did it and how that stability was affected by the recent global crisis, and how the future might be for this economy. In order to do that, I would like to, if you let me go to the next slide, I would like to organize my presentation in 4 parts. First, I would like to review the need for economic stability, especially for a country like Mexico. Secondly, I would like to give some insights on this Mexico's recent progress towards stability, what I might want to call the grade moderation, the Mexican grade moderation, just by analogy with the US grade moderation. Third, I would like to talk about our strategy and current challenges precisely related to stability. And finally, I will comment on Mexico's economic outlook. And at the end, I would like to have some time with you to exchange views about this or other economic subjects. Let me start with the idea of why economic stability is important for any country, but especially in a country like Mexico. Remember for those of you that are not economists, just a review very quickly. Economic stability, economists refer to as a situation that prevails for a long time, for a lengthy period, in which the real economic variables exhibit low variability. That we want to think in terms of basically GDP, that exhibits low variability. In the United States, as you know probably, in the period from 1984 to 2007, that characteristic, relative to the past of a very low variability in real economic variables, was actually happening and was known as the Great Moderation. The topic was very, very important some decades ago, especially when the economies in the world were highly volatile. But once it was found in the US and many other industrial countries, and later in some developing countries, the topic left the center stage of attention by economists, because at some point stability was taken for granted. Even there were some economists that thought that it was basically a normal situation from basically that time on. I mean, this century or at the beginning of this century for the rest of the foreseeable future. But however, as you know, we had a global financial crisis, and that crisis has taken back the attention to this kind of characteristic of an economy. Now, why economists pay attention to economic stability? Well, for the same reasons as any human pay attention to economic stability. In general, all human beings like certainty and dislike uncertainty. In general, everybody is happier with some sort of foreseeable, predictable horizon. And that is implied by measures of welfare losses. If anybody had or everybody had a certain horizon, he or she will make some plans for consumption. But if there is uncertainty, there are shocks, then probably the consumption path is not the optimal path, and there are welfare losses. The size of those welfare losses in a situation of instability is highly debated. There are people that say, well, those welfare losses are rather small, and some other authors have calculated, using other different models, that the possible welfare losses are huge. So therefore, many economists in different times have considered that governments should try to lessen economic fluctuations. If economic fluctuations are not the ideal way of living for human beings, it's a good idea. Could be a good idea for economic interventions on the part of the government, either through monetary policy or fiscal policy. However, as usual in economics, there is a trade-off between the benefits, expected benefits from this government intervention, and always some cost that may happen because maybe the intervention is not right on time, the right size. Maybe when the government intervenes it's a little late or it's too early. So in that trade-off has been found to be extremely difficult to evaluate. At least that's part of the debate that has not ended. Now, central banks, I represent a central bank, so I'm going to talk about these central banks. Central banks are usually primarily concerned, not only concerned with that, but not exclusively, but primarily concerned with what we call price stability, the stability of the general level of prices, controlling inflation. And that, as Professor Esquivel will tell you, brings you to what classical economists would tell you, that in general, the economic stability and price stability don't have to go together. I mean, that's the old thesis of money neutrality or money superneutrality. A change in the stock of money doesn't have to have anything to do with the real level of unemployment, only translates into the level of nominal variables such as the level of prices. No? But, putting those things aside and with some technicalities, we can confirm that reality is always right, independent from the models we use. And in reality, what we see in different economies is that economic stability, or real economic stability, that is the fluctuations of GDP, tends to be associated with an environment of low and stable inflation. There are different ways one can rationalize that kind of association or empirical verification, but in fact, put on the opposite side, highly unstable economies from the point of view of high inflations and volatile inflation rates tend to be also associated with economies with a lot of instability in business cycles, instability in the level of unemployment, and also the rate of growth. And these two things are particularly important for Mexico. And there are at least two reasons which are in that slide. On the real side, Mexico is an emerging economy, and economists have found that emerging economies tend to exhibit a more volatile consumption path, because usually emerging economies are affected by inflows from abroad, capital inflows from abroad. So there is a possibility for a very counter-cyclical current account of the balance of payments when there is a huge inflow. Emerging economies tend to import a lot and then therefore consume a lot. At the end, what you see is a path of more variability for consumption relative to income that will be predicted by the permanent income hypothesis of Professor Friedman, this sacrosanct house. So in Mexico, this economy has been hit by a lot of instability precisely through the channel of the balance of payments. And that it's very important to look at the issue of stability, the issue of real stability. But it's also very important to look at the issue of nominal stability, because also, along with the instability of the rate of growth, we have been suffering with a lot of instability coming from inflation. And inflation, as you know, in a country like Mexico, where a lot of people don't have normal access to the banking system, especially the low-income people, these people do not have, good access to hedge themselves against this uncertainty of inflation, making inflation truly a very regressive kind of tax. So that's the introduction. Let me go to the presentation now. So, given what the importance of stability, I hope I put enough examples for the importance of economic stability. Then I would like to make basically 4 points about these recent periods of stability that we have had basically since 1996. 4 points. And the section is actually put it as a question with a question mark. But the first point I'm going to make is that the recent period of stability, which, by the way, has been coinciding the price stability and the GDP stability up before the global crisis, is indeed can be put in terms of a great moderation in a close analogy to what we've seen in the United States. Let me try to make that point. Let's take a look at the long-term story of GDP fluctuations around trend in both Mexico and the United States. That's the graph. Those are deviations from the long-term trend of GDP since 1950. And what you see, hopefully, is that before 1973, the business cycles in Mexico were not that different to what you see was happening in the United States. More or less, they exhibited similar fluctuations. And also what you see is that since 1996, there has been a lot of synchronization, but the size of the fluctuation is also relatively similar to what you see in the United States. What is really different is what's happening between 1973 all the way to the tequila crisis in 1995. Then you had a lot of amplification of the Mexican business cycles. That's the first observation. Now, a similar observation you can make about the nominal behavior of the economy. That is to say, before 1973, the inflation rate was also relatively similar in Mexico and the United States. It's not exactly the same rate of growth of changing prices, but they are not that far off from each other. And since 1996, there has been some convergence of the inflation rate of Mexico towards the U.S. Towards the U.S. inflation rate. In the middle, we had a big chaos, not only for Mexico, by the way, but also for the United States. Although we have scale problems in order to appreciate that, even in the United States, inflation went up more than to a two-digit kind of range, and you see that on the graph. In the early 70s, during the 70s, although the United States never got into the mess we got during those years. So we had the same kind of separation after 73 all the way to 1996. But then on the streams there seemed to be again a similar behavior. Therefore, 1995 for Mexico seems to be a turning point. A turning point that is associated with the tequila crisis, in which the country suffered very, very heavily with a very deep economic contraction, a large currency devaluation, and an outburst of inflation. Now, since 1996, according to the graphs that I just went through, and excluding, of course, the years of recent global crisis, most economic indicators, real and nominal, have followed a smoother path. That's what we call, an approach to a stability period. I argue that we can call this recent period the Mexican Great Moderation. Now, you see that very clearly, although I'm not, I'm cheating a little bit with the scale again, but, all things equal, you see the same kind of behavior, no? Very high rates of inflation and then lower rates, especially on the Mexican side, converging to international levels, we say. And the same thing with the United States since 1984. The U.S. Great Moderation was baptized that way for a period since 1984, and the original authors examined the period from 1984 to 2001. But actually, the same characteristic that the authors, Stock and Watson, I think those are the names of the authors, Stock and Watson, prevail all the way in the United States all the way to 2007. So we can identify the U.S. Great Moderation with the period of 1984 to 2007. And I will argue that the Mexican Great Moderation happened since 1996 to 2007. And that's the final slide that I would like to share about this first claim that we had a period of stability. and we can call it that way. Just by looking at this table, you see the standard deviations of annual rates of growth for both prices and GDP. And for the respective periods that I was talking about, the second column corresponds to the great moderation of Mexico. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The fifth column corresponds to the U.S. great moderation, and the next columns tell you how much this variability was reduced during the respective great moderation periods. Obviously, the largest changes, especially for consumer prices, correspond to the emerging economy, the most volatile economy, which is Mexico. In particular, the rate of the standard deviation, the change in the standard deviation, that is the variation that was reduced by 30% during this period, and while in the United States it was reduced by 2.4 percentage points. And a similar situation, the comparison is a little more similar in terms of GDP for both countries, but still the direction and the definition of periods of great moderation apply for both countries. Now, the second point is that unlike the US, and that's I'm not anymore in academics, so I don't have to write a theorem for that. The staff of the bank can do some support in econometrics, but I will argue that unlike the United States, the case of Mexico's great moderation has, clearer causes, clearer forces that originated the stability situation than the case in the United States. In the literature, you can read that there is a lot of debate as to what finally cost the stability of the U.S. Some people say that it was purely good luck in terms of benign shocks for productivity, the openness of the economy to the rest of the world, the better management of just-in-time inventories, things like that. So, but it was just pure good luck coming from a shock, a favorable shock to productivity to the United States. And on the other extreme, there are some authors that claim that basically and mainly the U.S. great moderation was the result of better monetary policy. The Fed got to be a better manager of inflation, and that was transmitted into a better, a nicer environment for general economic activity. I would argue that the causes of Mexico's stability, given the mess that we had, given the fact that we had a lot of problems before 1996, those causes seem to be clearer in the case of Mexico. And notably, I would say that there is a strong role for better economic policy. It's very hard to justify this change, unlike in the case of the U.S., because the U.S. economy was more or less well behaved before this period. But in Mexico, it was a chaos, a financial and economic chaos before during this period that I refer to, the instability period. So my claim is that there were two especially important improvements in economic policy. On the one hand, a much stronger fiscal position, and on the other hand, an improved monetary policy framework. I'm going to argue about that later. And certainly, there was some role, some room for good luck, because if there was a benign international environment, being the economy open to the rest of the world, obviously we got some benefits out of that. But I would say economic policy truly played an important role. Basically, this slide says what I said. It's much easier to assign a greater way to improve the economic policy in our country, because there was much to correct, and there has been some correction. So it's probably not a coincidence that the two things happen together. The main source of instability was the fiscal mismanagement. During that period from 1973 all the way to the tequila crisis, in different ways, the country was extremely unstable, basically because of fiscal mismanagement and the fragility of the fiscal accounts relative to the external shocks. So it was very fragile. And basically what the fragility referred to was, in different times of the recent economic history, was that the government had a tendency towards increasing and being also very erratic, increasing public expenditures, but also correcting them once there was an external shock. So there was high and volatile government expenditures, and, which is very important, a trend of an unsustainable public sector debt, especially foreign debt. That was the case in the 1982 crisis, and dollar-linked domestic debt, the so-called tesobonos. We probably remember that drama or problem, and those were basic reasons that we had at the end recurrent financial and economic crisis in Mexico. Just to remember that those crises were not trivial. Remember that since the fourth quarter of 81 all the way to the third quarter of 83, which is the first major recession that we had in that unstable period, GDP fell 7.2%. But during the tequila crisis, GDP in only a few quarters, GDP fell 9.5%. Speaking about great recession, those were really great recessions, not the ones that you people just went through in the U.S. economy. Those were really deep recessions. And I don't want to minimize those are just reflections of the instability that we had. And this story is more or less what I just went through very quickly. At the beginning, it was just the monetization of fiscal deficits. That was the usual way of life from 1973 all the way to the 1982 crisis. And then in 1983, we changed our minds and say, well, maybe it's not a good idea to ask the central bank to monetize the fiscal deficit because, in the Chicago school, they teach you that eventually that's going to translate into perhaps higher rates of inflation, which is always, as it is usually the case from Chicago. Chicago was right. You don't have to go to Chicago in order to forecast inflation that way. But we went to a policy of continuous currency devaluation within a crawling peg regime in order to make the currency competitive. And we got into the highest inflation in modern economic history. I will say in the whole history that for which the Mexican economy has any data. So we went all the way to 160% annual rate of inflation in 1987. That was the result, partly, and I would say largely, the result of these competitive currency devaluations that we went through in order to promote exports and thereby promoting GDP, because that was, at that time, interpreted as the only way out of the foreign debt crisis that the government had. So we needed to generate foreign currency and international reserves in order to pay back the foreign debt. But that wasn't any good idea. That wasn't sustainable. And then in 1987, we had a stability pact that was attained based on a fixed exchange rate regime that worked very well during some few years. But then again, there was some problems with mounting short-term debt, which was in the form of the tesobonos that I referred to before, that led to a balance of payment crisis, recession, and inflation in 1995 of around 52%, if I recall correctly. That is the definition of fiscal dominance over monetary policy. Fiscal restraints over the degrees of freedom of monetary policy. Monetary policy is supposed to do other things, mainly stabilize the level of prices, but in those circumstances, there was either a direct monetization or an indirect monetization of the fiscal deficit or the problems or the fiscal problems. So there was a fiscal dominance, and the fiscal dominance is very well depicted here on this graph. In this graph, you see the CPI inflation and the public sector borrowing requirements, which is a comprehensive way of calculating the fiscal deficit. And what you see is that the red line, which is the CPI inflation, precedes in time the upsurge of inflation. The deficit precedes inflation. Or, as my assistant back in Mexico told me, the public deficit grandeur causes, that's in an econometric jargon, causes econometrically the fate of inflation. And that's the expression, or that's the manifestation of this fiscal dominance over the job of the central bank. The central bank was always accommodating the excess liquidity that was needed in order to finance the fiscal deficit in one way or another. During the 1980s, inflation was running behind the currency devaluation. The currency devaluation was ahead of the rate of inflation, but it was a similar manifestation of this fiscal dominance over monetary policy. That's the second point, that those factors causing the recent stability seem to be the corrective measures that Mexico took in order to eliminate the sources of the previous instability. But the third point that I would like to make is that as usual, instability distorts decisions, makes your life a little more confused. When you don't know how to read relative prices because there is a volatile and high rate of inflation, and you don't know if this cycle is really this increase in GDP is permanent or not, because since it is too volatile, you don't want to make enough decisions in terms of investment and things like that. So in general, instability distorts or is probably can leave you in a situation of confusion. Well, I would like to, my third point is that one of the confusions that may happen in an environment of instability is a confusion regarding the fundamental economic relationships in a country. I want to talk about something macro, but there are many things that happen also on a household level. And one of the illustration that I would like to make is that that the relationship between this great economy, I would like to ask myself what is the general view about the correlation between the GDP in Mexico and the United States. This usually, this is perhaps a little debated, but it is usually a commonplace that you find that the correlation between the two GDPs begins to be high after NAFTA, 1995, which is true. I mean, the correlation gets very high after NAFTA, but controlling for the exchange rate volatility, which is a nominal shock that the economy gets. Just controlling for that, taking into account statistically for that, and putting that aside, what you see is that the correlation between the two countries was already high before NAFTA. And this is the case. What you see on the right, on the left, is just the cycles with the raw data for the US and Mexico. Those are the trended Mexican industrial production for the blue line, and the trended US industrial production for the red line. And before 1996, you see that apparently there is a lot of separation. They don't move together. They don't show any kind of, or at least apparent association between the two series. What you see on the right-hand side, once you adjust for that variable, for the volatility of the real exchange rate, which translates into a nominal confusion for economic agents, then you see that the underlying industrial production adjusted for both countries, Mexico and the United, for Mexico adjusted for the real exchange rate, and then for the US, you see a much higher positive correlation between what's happening in the United States and Mexico, which shouldn't be also surprising, given at least the fact that the big movement for the opening of the economy happened in the mid-1980s. So at least for that reason, one should have found that relationship high even before NAFTA. But that's one example of the confusion that we should that may happen in a situation, in any economic situation. But that's an illustration for the global economy. Now, the fourth point, final point that I would like to make is that, an important question to ask is that, what about the recent global crisis? I've been talking about, all the way up to 2007. I'm avoiding the last 2 years, and I'm not trying to escape that reality because it's a reality. And I did it on purpose because I wanted to talk about the achievement of stability before, and then I would like to ask what's going to happen in the future. And certainly we had an important impact from the global financial crisis. The Mexican peso depreciated almost 40% in a few months. Output fell once again, another big recession, 6.5%, basically through the channel of a lower export demand on the part of the United States, or import demand on the part of the United States for Mexican exports. But for the first time in history, it wasn't us this time. That's really the big difference. This crisis was not caused by wrong economic policies, but it was totally an imported crisis, a result of a large external shock, both financial and real shock. Therefore, at least for the question is related to the heading of the slide, did the Mexican Great Moderation end with the recent crisis? My answer is a negative, a strong negative, because if my previous diagnosis is correct, then as long as good policies continue, prolonged instability is not an unavoidable fate for the economy. So we should come back soon to a stable situation, and very soon. And in fact, inflation hasn't suffered that much, and certainly most of the volatility was on the financial volatility was very short-lived, and the strongest impact was on the real side. But in the next two graphs, I'm going to just to illustrate the size of the shock, and what this graph is telling you is that the depreciation of the Mexican peso, which is on the red line, that is the price of the US dollars in terms of Mexican pesos, goes in the same direction as the price of the dollar in terms a basket of the trading partners of the United States. So it was a flight to safety movement, as you know, for the U.S. It was a widespread depreciation of most currencies in the rest of the world vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar. It had, at least to my knowledge, nothing to do with what was going on in the country. And the same thing about the real side of the impact. There was a sharp contraction of the U.S. industrial production, the red line, that was translated into a sharp contraction for our exports to that country. Remember that about 80% of the manufacturing exports of Mexico come to this country. Now, let me just finish with I'm going to go very quickly to the third section, stabilization strategies and challenges. I basically suggested what was the strategy for what we had in the stability. And let me just make a comment here. Stability is probably not very important for you in this economy because this economy has been very stable for many, many years. And actually, that was one of the main comments that I made at the beginning. Stability was actually, or tends to be taken for granted in many economies, but not in Mexico. So this is just like a precious achievement. But how did we get this better environment of stabilization? Well, we got rid of predetermined exchange rate regimes. We never did it successfully. It was very difficult, So for some time in the past, we lived well with a fixed exchange rate regime, but at the end, because the central bank didn't have any international reserves left, we didn't have any other option but to let the currency float, which has proven to be a decent and good economic policy because, among other things, it gives people, investors, and even the government the right incentives not to get into much indebtedness to the rest in foreign currency. It's an incentive to limit the mismatching relative to foreign currencies. And also, there was a tendency to keep the fiscal deficit under control, but also accompanied by some measures related or intended to in the sense of getting a more sustainable basis of revenues, basically. So there had been some measures regarding the enhancement of revenue sources in the sense since the 1995 crisis, there was an increase in the value-added tax. There were some new taxes during these years. But basically, the government has been trying to enhance its revenue sources. Also, there had been, at the beginning, there were, some expenditure cuts any time there were revenue shortfalls. When President Cedillo was the president, he was an excellent and bright economist, so he will tell Minister Gurria what to do. But after Cedillo left the office, the country moved forward, and now the Congress incorporates automatic expenditure cuts in case there are revenue shortfalls, which is sort of an automatic stabilization process. And there has been a recent law, or in 1996 there was a law called the Act of Budget and Fiscal Responsibility, following, not perfectly following, but trying to follow the Chilean example of keeping the long-term structural deficit on balance. And there has been also, importantly, a better management of the public debt, so there is lower exposure. There has been much lower exposure to foreign currency, and there has been a development of the local peso debt market for longer term maturities, such as all the way to 30 years. So the government places debt more heavily on the domestic market, leveraged on institutional investors like the pension funds and some mutual funds. Now, and given that there has been some strengthening of the fiscal stance, then there have been, the central bank has been able to strengthen its own monetary policy. The other way, it wasn't possible. So there has been some effective, there has been an effective independence of the central bank, which was legally granted to the central bank in 1993. But given the fiscal dominance that I was referring to, the independence wasn't really effective until 1996, once the things started to improve gradually. So there has been an isolation from fiscal pressures, and the credibility, we believe, the credibility of the central bank. We never declare victory, but the credibility, I think, is gradually being gained by the central bank based on more or less consistent monetary policies, and also our commitment to the targets. At the beginning, we had intermediate targets in terms of the rates of growth of monetary aggregates, but now, since year 2000, we are following, we are in an inflation targeting scheme. It seems that is working correctly. And there are certain, some authors that have already investigated the evidence that monetary policy has contributed to reduce economic volatility. So there is some evidence in that sense by some academicians. Although I will say that the authors that are referred to there did not consider the fiscal side. They actually are attributing all the merit of better, more stable economic environment, 100% in that research, to better monetary policy. But I would argue, as I said before, that better monetary policy has been only possible thanks to the isolation from the fiscal dominance. And fortunately, although it's not universal in any country, but fortunately, because of good luck, I would say that there was no evidence of the so-called sacrifice ratio. I mean, how much growth you have to sacrifice in order to lower inflation. Actually, the years of faster growth, good luck, during the Mexican Great Moderation coincided with the largest declines of inflation when the United States was growing in the second half of the 1990s. The U.S. had a great economic growth. Also, we were just benefited from the first years of NAFTA. So actually, those years were very, very, very good in terms of economic growth. So that's the role of also good luck, which is always appreciated. And that is referred to in the last line as the external environment being favorable. However, there are always challenges in life, and of course, the fiscal and monetary authorities are not exceptions to that general rule. So we need the government to further strengthen its fiscal position, to reduce all those things you probably have read on the papers. The government depends too much in its revenues from oil. I mean, the oil, it depends on the price of oil, but it's certainly higher than 30% of the government's revenues depends on oil, which is very fragile. No? Also, we need, the government to improve its tax efficiency, probably move the structure towards more efficient taxation, perhaps a little more on consumption, a little less on marginal income taxes, whatever, no? And also increase the spending efficiency. But at the end, we need the government to maintain this control deficit in the long run on a sustainable basis. And also the central bank has a task here that hasn't finished yet, hasn't attained, which is the consolidation of inflation to its 3% inflation target. And for that reason, in order to do that, it's important to avoid regressions to the past. We don't want to go back to competitive devaluations because we already went through that in our own laboratory. And also it's important in the same way to be aware of what monetary policy can and cannot do, the old lessons that this sacrosanct university always taught us. And there is a long-term growth, challenge that I haven't talked about, which is even more important than everything I said before. I said, basically I'm devoted all my presentation to the issue of price stability and economic stability because I think they are more or less interrelated, as I pretended to explain here, but also because I am in a central bank in which we think our best contribution is to provide a stable framework in terms of financial stability and nominal stability in order for economic agents to have a better life and to achieve better decisions. But the country itself has a deeper problem, perhaps with some relationship with the old times instability, but the most important problem that the country has is very low, discouraging, frustrating rate of economic growth, which during the years of the stability, the great moderation was around 3.4%, but still, there is a lot of poverty in the country. So those rates seem to be rates related to an advanced, mature economy. It's not an economy all ready for exploiting new opportunities and new investment opportunities. So, and the challenge is illustrated in this graph. On this graph, you see what has happened to total factor productivity, or that is the efficiency in which economic factors are used. That has been exhibiting a persistent positive trend, that's the red line, for the United States, and a decline with certain reversion in the case of Mexico, and still with a level that is lower than the 1981 peak. So that's the challenge, and for that we need certainly important reforms that I don't want to talk extensively about that, but we need reforms that will let us be more competitive, let us have more competition in all markets, and let us have more market flexibility. We need openness for private investment in some sectors that currently are not allowed to receive private investment. We need more better infrastructure, better government services as well, and the promotion of competition in every sector that is possible. So let me just share with you a couple of lines, a couple of slides about the economic outlook of Mexico. First, as you know, the world economy has been recovering since the middle of 2009 at least, and the U.S. Very clearly has been recovering, although at different paces and different degrees, but the world economy has been recovering, and the international trade levels are also picking up. In particular, the U.S. rebound has actually encompassed basically all components of aggregate demands, including consumption and also investment. So my impression is that the U.S. rebound is relatively solid, in spite of all the news that one reads on the papers. Still, perhaps the pessimism that is everywhere relates to the high unemployment rates and the low consumer confidence that is read in this economy, and that probably contribute to explain some recent signs of slower dynamism in certain economic indicators. For that reason, the Fed has, as you know, expressed its intentions to maintain an extremely accommodative monetary policy in the future. So one should expect that to continue in the next years. But my impression, and I guess the impression of many economists at this point, is that the U.S. is still, in the world, is still far enough from a so-called double dip, that is a situation of a new recession. There are many indicators, benchmarks, leading indicators that tell you if you get closer to that line, then you're in trouble. those different indicators still suggest, based on previous recessions, that the U.S. economy, fortunately, especially for us, and for you too, still very far from a recession. Now, the Mexican economy, I don't have to tell you or remind you that it's very, very close to what happens to the United States. So whatever I said about the U.S. economy applies almost literally to the Mexican economy, especially to the external sector. The economy has been exhibiting finally, year-on-year rates of growth which are positive. And the main driver has been of the upturn has been the U.S. demand for Mexican exports, especially manufacturing exports that I talked about before. The domestic spending component of GDP has been lagging behind, especially investment. We are concerned about the very weak behavior of investment. And construction, the construction sector that was hit by the crisis, although we didn't have any bubble in the real estate market. Partly we like to think that it's a result of very good regulation and supervision on our part. I think that's part of the reason, because of the tequila crisis. I think we have a better regulatory and supervisory framework, but also because of good luck. Certain, these sophisticated derivative markets and securitization markets that were the main important highways in this construction or this construction of bubbles in the real estate market, and given the very immature market or very low level of lending in our economy relative to GDP, we never got to a situation of a bubble or a financial crisis. So in that sense, that's not the reason why construction is stagnant. The reason is that banks, although they continued lending in the mortgage market, actually that's something interesting. You never saw a reduction on a year-on-year basis of mortgage lending in the banking system in Mexico. But there was a lot of deceleration, because my impression is that households have become a little more prudent and risk-averse this time. There has been some unemployment. There was a rise in unemployment. So there was a reaction on the demand side. And also, banks raised their risk evaluation standards. So there has been some slowing down of construction in the private sector, especially in households, in the housing market. In summary, the Bank of Mexico is estimating, although you're going to see perhaps a different estimate pretty soon, but right now the official estimate is that the expectation, the GDP growth is going to close this year between 4 and 5%. The estimate is a little closer to 5% in GDP. And for next year, the rate of growth will be between 3.2% and 4.2%. That's an interval that is published in our last quarterly inflation report. And in terms of inflation, as I said, it has been behaving relatively well. It's within the interval. As I mentioned before, our target is 3%, but there is an interval for transitory variations of plus and minus 1 percentage point. So it's a little bit below 4%, although there has been some favorable environment from the rest of the world that has also helped us to achieve that. And my final remarks are those 5, and let me just say them just to close the presentation. Hopefully that I conveyed a clear message and I didn't make you sleep for too long. My first purpose or the idea that I would like to leave with you with is that Mexico suffered long periods of economic, and price instability that severely depressed living standards. There is a translation for welfare losses. We had a lot of those, even though for a normal industrial country, welfare losses may be small. In Mexico, I'm sure they were very, very large. Secondly, since 1996, a new stability era seems to have emerged based on sound fiscal and monetary policies. I think there is no way to avoid that, to escape that there was a change there. The recent global crisis doesn't have to imply a return to instability. So if we continue, and I'm confident that we are going to continue with good economic policies, stability, the great moderation should continue after this large financial crisis or international crisis. Strengthening fiscal and monetary foundations, however, can widen the stability benefits in the future. It's not an all-finished task that we already have. And finally, we need reforms. Reforms that I haven't talked about, that I just briefly mentioned, but they are extremely important if we want to enhance productivity and thereby the living standards of all Mexicans. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for some questions. So if anyone would like to, you can take your own question. No,
We are exhausted. So.
but would you like to take your own questions?
It seems like one of your main points is that in the early 90s, especially under Zedillo, there was better fiscal management. And that's part of what led to reduction in volatility. What do you think accounted for this? And do you think there's lessons for other countries trying to reduce volatility, or just locked in?
The second half of the 1990s, was when better fiscal policy started. That's the beginning of what I call, I guess I'm not the only one who calls that, but what we call the Mexican Great Moderation. Well, that was the realization that we had did so many wrong things. And I would say that we were very lucky having a very, very good economist in the presidency. And, the right people were making economic policies work. And I think, looking at the past after the trauma of the tequila crisis, it was certainly easy for the population in general. Not easy, but because it was, the effects were really distressing after the crisis. But I guess the realization that there should be a stop for making the same mistakes over and over again. That's a short way to put it.
So thanks for coming to talk to us. Questions about NAFTA. You said that NAFTA did not really cause the correlation between business cycles in the U.S. and Mexico that existed there prior to FX volatility. Have you done any other studies on NAFTA, and do you think it's a positive or negative, or which aspects do you view as positive or negative for Mexico, and do you think that NAFTA should maybe be expanded to other countries in Latin America, and if so, then which time frame?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm glad that you asked, because I didn't want to leave I wouldn't like to leave the impression that I don't appreciate the effect of NAFTA. Actually, if you look at the corrected trend or the adjusted series for industrial production in Mexico, you actually see an increase in the correlation between the two countries. That's a reflection that we got closer in terms of international trade and foreign investment. And we certainly had we have had very good benefits out of a larger pie for sharing in terms of larger scope of trade. As you know, trade is very good for any country, and especially for a developing country in which you enlarge the the market so importantly with NAFTA. So the answer is that definitely there were very positive results. As far as I understand and I'm aware of, there have been some studies, especially by Professor Ann Kruger, showing that the deviation of trade away from other possible trading partners have been very small related to, and the expansion of trade has been very substantial. So there hasn't been any sacrifice, say, deviating ourselves from trading with other countries, because in that case, if we had that being the case, then that wouldn't be a perfect conclusion from, for defending NAFTA. But definitely, NAFTA has been an important leverage for our country. And in general, any economist, especially a graduate from this school, will tell you that it is better to have a multilateral liberalization of trade barriers. And of course, I will be in favor of extending any trade agreement with this important, the largest economy in the world with any other country. So I think there are benefits, and they are summarized by this higher correlation in that graph. But what I meant is that we were already associated with that particular country because our most important movements toward openness happened before NAFTA. That's all I wanted to specify.
Yeah, my question is about asset prices. Currently, the Mexican government bonds are about 150 basis points behind the U.S. bonds. The Mexican bolsa has been over 10% this year. The Mexican peso has also rebounded a lot this year. Do you think that those assets are fairly priced? What's your outlook for that?
That's the 100 million question. Of course, there is a widespread concern, not only in Mexico, but in most emerging economies, about the possible effects of a lax monetary policy in the United States on our economies. And we certainly have had a lot of, in Mexico, like Brazil and in other emerging economies, we have had a lot of capital inflows, portfolio inflows that have been pushing bond prices up and putting a very favorable, putting a set of extremely favorable conditions for the local debt, and also for placing Mexican debt abroad. The government just placed a billion debt for 100 years at a very, very low interest rate, which is part of the environment of optimism. It is very difficult to say if a price at a specific point in time is fair or not, because when a lot of people say it's fair, it's difficult to be against that crowd. You know what I mean? Those prices could be in a fragile situation, and we are ready to see eventually a reversal of those prices, because that happens all the time. When optimism or exuberance, as the former chairman of the Federal Reserve used to call, stops, then we are ready to see a sudden stop in those flows and then a reversal of prices. We are conscious that basically nothing has changed in our economy except that this maintenance of a very lax U.S. monetary policy. So we are monitoring possible risks at the central bank. That's all I can tell you. But to tell you otherwise, to go short on the market is a very risky proposition on my part.
Do you think that the different talking about, like, for instance, the oil prices going down, or at least are not as high as they used to be a few years ago. The internal conflict situation and the different pressures that the government is facing, do you think they're going to affect that fiscal stability?
Well, the government's always under a lot of, or facing a lot of risk related to the oil prices. It's an important piece of negotiation for in negotiating the budget. As you know, the government has been hedging itself in the past years and has done that this year. Securing a certain price. If the price comes down, that level gets some secured revenues. So there is always that kind of a risk, and this is why it's very important that the government moves towards a wider wider tax base and a non-oil source of revenues in order to isolate the economy from those shocks. The shocks that I was referring to when President Cedillo was in presidency and Gurria was the Minister of Finance were 3 consecutive cuts or substantial falls in the oil prices that were translated hand in hand with expenditure cuts. What we want is, what you would like to have is some stability fund, and that the government has an oil stability fund, but it's probably not enough in order to face fluctuations. But there is always some savings for rainy days in other funds. Those are possible volatility factors for the government. Remember, oil is relatively unimportant for the country itself because oil represents a very small percentage for the trade account and the balance of payments. But it's extremely important for the government. So it's part of the strengthening of the fiscal position. To move away from, so to speak, from oil in some way, with a huge stabilization fund or hedging enough, which is costly though, but it has been the typical and traditional, one of the typical and traditional sources of instability for the government. So the answer is, if oil prices come down really sharply, then the government, if for this year it's already hedged, but for next year we'll have to see what happens.
Thank you for the presentation. First, I would like to ask you about, especially productivity. What do you think about incentives in the economy for productivity, especially when the Mexican economy is mainly focused on manufacturing and it's not a high-tech driven economy? So what are the things that you're thinking could be useful, especially for sectors like telecommunications, energy, and other ones that are structured?
Well, I would answer in 3 parts: competition, and competition. We need a lot more competition. The examples you're giving relate to certain oligopolistic power on the part of providers, and we need a lot of more market players, a lot of more interaction, a lot of more openness to innovation. And the only way is to liberalize markets. I don't imagine any other way to do it. So that will be my recipe. But of course, there are no recipes here, because one has to remember that in the business of economic growth, there are many things that have to happen in the right way. And several things. I mean, you cannot say let's come up with a new NAFTA with China and leave everything else constant or even deteriorating. So you have to, in economic policy and in public policy in general, you have to move in very different fronts. In general, I will say that we need a higher quality of government services, infrastructure, security of property rights, more predictability. Of course, we have this problem of public security now related to a question that I'm lucky that you haven't asked, but related to what you always read in the papers, which is this violence in Mexico. So many things have to be combined, but the bottom line will be that, for me, is that better government services in general, and stronger and tougher competition in all possible markets.
You mentioned that the trade moderation is going to sacrifice growth in favor of stability. But what about the crisis? Because it has been argued that the Mexican government should have been more active in changing with a more flexible fiscal policy to.
I'm glad you're asking that. I forgot to say something about it. Yeah. Well, there are two, like the official answer and the extra-official answer. Yeah, the official. The statistics, you see the statistics of government expenditures, for instance, they exhibit, for the first time in many years, certain counter-cyclical effort. Of course, it wasn't enough. But there has been some counter-cyclical behavior for the first time in many cycles on the part of government expenditures. Those expenditures really slowed down in the last part of last year because of lower oil revenues, and that the Ministry of Finance calculated that they didn't have enough revenue given the commitment of a certain deficit that they were allowed to by Congress. So they stopped with these counter-cyclical measures on the fiscal side, and of course, on the monetary side, the central bank lowered the policy interest rate by 375 basis points during the 7 months of 2009. Having said that, that's the official answer, and that's the statistical answer. The other answer is that we didn't feel like we could do much more. That's very debatable, no? But you have to be very careful at not behaving as if you were already a very stable, very credible economy, pretending that everything, your history is with you. It's specifically at the central bank, we are still trying to conduct inflationary expectations toward our target. So if we conducted a much laxer monetary policy, our impression was that probably the effect was going to be mild because of the strong influence from the U.S. Industrial production, which is extremely difficult to counteract. So how many hundreds of basis points you would have had to lower the policy interest rate in order to more or less slightly touch the effect of a sharply falling U.S. industrial production, maybe all the way to 0%. And in that case, given the fact that we were facing an upward trend in inflation, we would probably be risking our credibility and our commitment to the inflation target. I understand this is rather debatable. We didn't try. We have had a negative real interest rate for quite a while. It has been, naturally lax, but not extremely lax. And we feel that it has paid, there are always costs in life, including in economic policy. We could have tried a different scenario, but let's take a look at a different scenario. Imagine that we managed that with very, very strong countercyclical policies, some offsetting of the external shock. Maybe we would have had a fiscal deficit similar to the one in the United States and also in some countries in the European Union. But for a country like Mexico and a country like an emerging with a very long history of instability, the costs probably would have been very much higher than these more stable countries. So you have to weight all those factors, and that is the reason. That is the reason. But, you have to see, in the U.S. the problem is deflation. We have had no experience in our whole history of any risk of deflation. So that's a very different situation. Inflation has been with us all the time. So we have to still fight with the risk of inflation, and that at least gives you the idea of these constraints that economic policy has in Mexico.
So, everyone, please join us for the reception upstairs, and let's continue asking Manuel interesting questions, but in an informal setting. So thank you again for coming.